Technically, the reading in the book of Luke started in week 10. The last day of week 10 was Luke chapter 1. And again, we are following the 5daybiblereading.com plan, which is linked in the description below. And if you've been reading along in the New Testament in 2020, following the plan, this is the second of the four Gospels. We started with the book of Mark, did some epistles, and now coming back to Luke. If you're just seeing this for the first time and you haven't been following the plan, this would be, I'd say, for the New Testament, a great time to start and stick with the plan, at least for the next few months. Luke is critical. Luke, the person, is critical for the writing of the New Testament. He is a co-worker and a friend and a fellow traveler of the Apostle Paul, and he writes Luke and Acts as a two-part story, really, a prequel and a sequel, I don't know, two parts written by Luke, who was closely connected to the Apostle Paul. And the first part, the Gospel of Luke, tells us the story of Jesus and his ministry. And the second part, the book of Acts, tells us the story of the apostles carrying on the ministry of Jesus. And all that together makes up a huge portion. It's like 20 or 25% of the New Testament textually is this two-part composition put together by Luke. And it's clear, even in the first paragraph of the book of Luke, that Luke was very meticulous in not only researching this, and we could think about his connection to the Apostle Paul, Paul having the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and how that might have assisted Luke in writing this. But also, I think we should see and hear that Luke was active in interviewing people that were eyewitnesses of these accounts. And particularly maybe even Mary. We see a lot about Mary, especially early on in the story. So Luke was meticulous in researching and was intent on putting together an account, he says, that would be orderly. Your translation may say chronological, but there is a thought. I don't necessarily think it has to be chronological in terms of time, but there's thought and organization in Luke's writing. You see in the beginning of Luke, the beginning of Acts, that he is writing this to a particular individual named Theophilus. And we don't know the whole story there in terms of why Luke is writing to this person named Theophilus. But he says at the beginning of Luke that one of the reasons, maybe the main reason, is so that he would have greater certainty about the things that he was taught. And so Luke has researched this. He has carefully written it down and organized this for Theophilus and for anybody who's reading it to have more certainty about the things they're taught about Jesus. And you definitely see that throughout. Notice even in these first few chapters of Luke, how many times he stops to give historical context. There's an accuracy about Luke in saying this is what was going on at the time when these things happened. And that's just one example of maybe the meticulous work that Luke has done in researching and in writing. There's a lot packed into the book of Luke, again, being as big as it is. You'll notice early on the chapters themselves are long. I'm not sure why they were divided up that way. But there's so much there and so many themes that we can't really say everything. And we are going to be in Luke exclusively for the next 3 weeks or more. And so we'll have more opportunities to address some of the themes in later weeks' videos. But let me start with one that comes from chapter 1. Chapter 1 is the parallel account of the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus. John being Jesus's forerunner, the prophet who comes to prepare the way for God, for the Messiah to come. And so John's birth is announced, and then John is born. And at the end of the chapter, John's dad, Zacharias, gives this psalm, this song of praise to God. And simultaneously, then we have the announcement of Jesus's birth, Jesus being born really in chapter 2 is when he's born, but in chapter 1, we have Mary's song of praise. And notice some of the language of that in chapter 1 of Luke, verse 50 and following, really 49. The mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy is upon generation after generation for those who fear him. He has done mighty deeds with his arm. Notice what Mary says God has done in bringing about the birth of the Messiah. He has scattered those who are proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things. He has sent away the rich empty-handed. He has given help to Israel, his servant, in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, to his descendants forever. A couple big things that Mary points out that will be foundational to understanding the gospel, the good news that is being proclaimed in Luke's composition. One is this idea that God is lifting up the humble. Mary is a perfect example of that. She's a nobody, and yet she is the one God chooses to use to fulfill this great plan. We see that in the way Jesus is born into nothing in the world's eyes. How it is shepherds that have the good news announced to them. How there are these widows and widowers in the temple that greet Jesus when he is born. There's no grand procession for him like the birth of royalty, but it is that Jesus is born in humility, and it is the humble that God has chosen to lift up. Other examples of that you see throughout these early chapters of Luke, and we'll continue to see that as we go forward. But along with lifting up the humble, God is also bringing down the proud. Notice who that might include in these early chapters of Luke. We read some about the establishment, so to speak, King Herod and his wickedness, and how John preaches against that. We see in these early chapters how the religious leaders of the day are in opposition to Jesus. And there seems to be this theme throughout as God is lifting up those who are really nothing in the world's eyes, outcast, sick, lame, women who would have been looked on in that society as less or inferior. These people are being lifted up. Outsiders, Gentiles are being lifted up. And the proud, those that you think would have the power, have the authority, have the in, whether that's religiously or politically, they are being brought low. That's what Mary emphasizes in her prayer in chapter 1, and that's what you see emphasized in the book of Luke. So be looking for that. It happens over and over and over again. But quickly, the other thing I'll say about what Mary says in her song is that what God is doing in Jesus, in the birth of Jesus, she says it is him giving help to Israel, his servant, and fulfilling the promise made to Abraham. This is what's going on. As Jesus is being brought into the world, as Messiah is coming into the world, God is fulfilling his promise to Israel. And so we see that in chapter 2, both Simeon and Anna in the temple will say, hey, God, you are fulfilling the promises you made to your people, Israel. And that's exactly right. All those, the patriarchs that received promises, the prophets that made those promises in the Old Testament, the coming of Jesus is the fulfillment of all of that. But it's done in a way that no one expected. The promises are fulfilled to Israel by bringing in everybody, people from all nations that will submit to this king, to King Jesus. And they didn't see that coming, or most of them didn't see that coming. And all of this, I think, is summarized in the kind of perfect intro story to Jesus's ministry. Luke is the only one who does this. He begins with the story in chapter 4. After he's been baptized, after he's been tempted in the wilderness, the first story Luke tells is his return to Nazareth. And at Nazareth, Jesus reads a passage of scripture from Isaiah 61 where he says basically what we've already described, that God has anointed him to lift up the humble, to preach the good news to the poor, to bring release to the captives, to give sight to the blind, so on and so forth, to proclaim the year of the Lord. Maybe the Jubilee year is in reference there, which we talked about in the book of Leviticus. And people are amazed by that. But Jesus will go on to say that this salvation that is coming about in him, that God has promised all the way back in the prophet Isaiah, this salvation is not maybe going to be for who they expect. And he tells two stories from the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha, that Elijah could have healed or could have helped any widow in Israel, but he helped a foreign widow, the widow of Zarephath. And Elisha could have helped any leper in Israel, but he helped a foreign leper, the Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. And the point is this, that as God is fulfilling his promises to Israel, no longer will it be on the basis of birth. And maybe it never has been on the basis of birth. That may be the point. But that God is looking for a kingdom of people, not of one certain race, ethnicity, or people group. God is looking for a kingdom of people that will humble themselves, that will come to him, acknowledging they're nothing, and humbly being willing to receive the healing of the Messiah, receive the freedom of the Messiah, the sight that the Messiah is bringing, and to give themselves wholeheartedly to him. And that's what we see in Luke. And as we conclude this week, we read in some ways what is the manifesto of this upside down kingdom. And that is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. It seems to be a different sermon, but a lot of the same ideas we see in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But this is it. Blessed are the poor, the hungry, the brokenhearted. Woe to the rich and powerful and comfortable in this age. There's this reversal that's going on. And all of the things that he teaches there about not acting to get vengeance, but loving your enemies, not judging, but being generous and giving, both with your understanding towards other people as well as your material possessions. This is what Jesus is looking for. Not people that say, Lord, Lord, and say that they are God's people, but those who will actually be God's people from the inside out, and by humbling themselves and appearing to all the world as crazy or as weird, but giving themselves over to this gospel that has taken them over, and devoting themselves wholeheartedly to their King. All right, so we're going to be in Luke for a while. And so notice these things as we read, and much more as we get through chapter 6 by the end of week 11 in our 2020 Bible reading. Thank you.